Well, thank you very much. I think the topic is a very interesting topic for me to talk about, because basically what we're seeing right now is a complete collusion of different types of technologies that we have been exposed to. As organizations have come out of the pandemic or beginning to come out of the pandemic, what we're finding is the overall approach to connectivity, transacting on a day-to-day basis is changing. The pandemic taught us many different things, and working from home was a good example where all of a sudden you would be required to work from home, connect into the enterprise environment, and then also being connecting into the cloud environment has really exposed us to different ways that we could imagine. A bit about myself. So my name is Shah Sheikh. I'm a co-founder and a cybersecurity advisor at DTS, but my entrepreneurship journey started some time ago. I've been doing various different types of projects, as you can imagine. My main focus is in cybersecurity, but then I've been also supporting in different areas in terms of building a bug bounty platform, also a B2B marketplace. I've also been heavily involved in the crypto space as well, with working as a CISO for a regulated OTC firm. And then along the way, I've also been focused on building platforms and crowdfunding platforms, and also social development apps and spiritual development apps as well. And my background specifically focuses on the tech, but because of my involvement in cybersecurity, I've also sort of understood really how cybersecurity is required to be embedded from a product perspective as you start your entrepreneurship journey as well. Now, you might have seen that security is playing a key role. There's not a week that actually goes by where you do not find a major headline in the news about a cybersecurity breach. Big companies, small companies, they all get impacted from a security breach at some point in time. The key question is always to understand how well you protect your environment to prevent this breach itself. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that no matter how big of an organization you are or how small you are, hackers will always try to target you as a valuable asset if there is an economic means for them to gain certain rewards from. And what we're seeing is that over the years, there's been an increase in the number of cyber attacks. And also what we're seeing is that nowadays, the number of cyber attacks are increasing in volume, but not only in volume, but they're also increasing in sophistication and the intent level as well. Now, when we start looking at cybersecurity from a global landscape perspective, you will find that the Middle East itself, now when we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about the GCC region in general. It has a very different landscape compared to the global landscape. And that's very important to understand when it comes to cybersecurity itself, because the better we understand data, the better we will understand how we need to protect ourselves as an organization, as a startup, as a platform, as a product that you might be looking to launch, etc. Now, what you see in this particular slide is that there's a key difference between the global average of a data breach versus the average of the cost of a data breach within the Middle East. Now, what's very interesting here is you see the results of the time to actually detect a data breach itself. Globally, it takes around 279 days. That's awfully a long time for a breach to be identified. Whereas in the Middle East, it actually takes you over 1 year itself. And that's, of course, the average. Could be plus or minus, but generally speaking, within the Middle East, organizations do not do enough to detect a data breach. Maybe they're not monitoring systems, maybe they haven't protected systems, maybe they don't have the right controls in place to be able to detect this breach. So if a malicious actor, a hacker, is inside your environment for a long period of time, it then means that the overall impact is going to be a lot higher as well. Now, what you see also with the explosion of technology, the explosion of startups, of fintech firms and companies, and also the maturity within cybersecurity, every single country within the region is now implementing cybersecurity at a national level, and then enforcing that from regulators and sector leaders to be pushed into different sectors themselves. So whether you look at the energy sector, you look at the BFSI or the banking financial services sector, you look at the healthcare sector, each of these different sectors are now being mandated to follow cybersecurity practices. Now, if you look at the GCC in general, across UAE, across Bahrain, across Saudi, and Qatar as well, you have the agencies that are now building and have already built a cybersecurity standard, which now need to be enforced and implemented by critical infrastructure and major corporations. And so that's driving, again, a lot of the security projects, the need to secure the environments. But again, there's a good understanding by the regulators that security needs to be embedded into every single organization. And again, that's going to be supporting the GDP, the national economy, and also making the nation more cyber resilient as well. But one of the interesting data sets you see as well is that there's regulation coming at the industry level. So whether you look at, for example, when you look at the BFSI industry in Bahrain, as an example, you have certain set of regulations around the use of open banking concepts. If you look at Capital Market Authority in Saudi, again, they have a dedicated cybersecurity guideline. If you look at Central Bank of Kuwait, again, in Kuwait, you have a certain security guideline that all the banks need to follow. And so what you're beginning to see is that each industry is now also augmenting the national cybersecurity mandates into something more industrially or industrialized focused, right? Similarly, what we find is that the financial hubs, so whether you look at DIFC, you look at CBB, you look at ADGM, there's also a heavy focus around data protection. And this is predominantly being driven by international, or EU regulations such as GDPR, which is having a lot of focus around data protection itself, right? So as an entrepreneur and as a startup or even as an organization, if you're handling a huge amount of personal data, it needs to be protected because at the end of the day, it's customer records and you need to make sure that those data sets are protected. And that's one of the reasons why we see an explosion also around data protection regulation, or DPR as we call it. Similarly, there's international standards as well when it comes to security. So, ISO 27001 is a well-established framework for implementing strong cybersecurity practices within an organization. PCI, again, if you're handling credit card data, CDH, or you're carrying out payment-related services, PCI becomes important, and so on and so forth. So cybersecurity is now really becoming an all-encompassing domain where you have different stakeholders. Some stakeholders are classified as internal stakeholders, some are external stakeholders, and it's very important that as an entrepreneur, starting up a business or running a platform, you will be exposed to regulatory requirements. And so therefore, it's always recommended to ensure security is practiced at a much early stage. Now, when we're talking about cybersecurity in general, we talk about technology in general, there are some major changes that's happening around the world right now. The World Economic Forum runs a series of different types of activities. One of the major worrisome risks for any organization within top 10 risks post-COVID, as you see, number 3, cyber attack and data fraud due to a sustained shift in working patterns. And that is across all different types of risks that we find, prolonged recession globally because of the global economic downturn, surge in bankruptcies, et cetera, we also see cyber attacks as one of the key worrisome factors for any organization post-pandemic. And what's given rise to that is multiple factors. Working from home has opened multiple vectors when it comes to increasing the potential of a cyber attack. We're also finding that social engineering, or what we call phishing emails, right? Sending phishing emails to employees, to individuals, has been a very effective approach, especially when people have been working from home. And we also saw public sector, critical infrastructure and government entities, along with healthcare sector as well. So we saw hospitals, we saw pharmaceutical companies extremely targeted during the COVID period, especially trying to get intellectual property and certain data sets as well, which can be very valuable from the cyber criminals' perspective. So when we look at 2021 this year, and we look at beyond, what do we see from a cybersecurity perspective? Now, these are just, again, some key points that I would like to highlight, and some things that will, again, resurface again as we cover through the presentation. But one important thing to understand is that there's a rise in the sophisticated type of attacks, cyber attacks, specifically related to ransomware. Ransomware can be a major issue if it is exploited successfully within your organization. What we've seen over the last couple of years, ransomware can cripple a business, especially if you do not have the recovery controls in place, right? And this is essentially a type of malware that once it enters your system, it encrypts all the files on your systems, and it can spread potentially from one machine to another, and eventually leading all of those systems in your environment to be encrypted and therefore cannot be utilized, or let's say your systems cannot be utilized. And this is a major type of attack, and we've seen that history can repeat itself, and these type of attacks are getting more and more, let's say, exploited, and also becoming more sophisticated as well. What we're seeing is an increase in the supply chain attacks. And what we mean by supply chain is basically targeting the higher food chain of the ecosystem. So what that means is, if you're a software developer, or let's say you're developing a technology platform, and this technology platform is serving 10,000 customers or 1,000 customers, if you as a technology or software developer or development company is targeted by a sophisticated cyber attack, and the attackers then inject a malicious code into your software, this software is then distributed to your 1,000 customers. Those 1,000 customers are then materially breached. What that means is the supply chain attack has targeted, or let's say the supply chain attack, from the hacker's perspective, they targeted one organization, but is in essence, they've actually targeted 1,000 organizations because of the supply chain scenario. And these type of attacks are also increasing. We saw some major supply chain attacks happening over 2020 and 2021 as well. We're also seeing that the digital economy is now driven through the growth of startup and fintechs. And all of these companies, that are changing the way we transact on a day-to-day basis, whether it's a health tech app, or whether it's a robo advisory firm, or a startup that's helping you invest in stocks and ETFs and so on and so forth. All of these different startups and fintech, they handle huge amount of data sets, and the need for cybersecurity and data privacy becomes also more important as well. A lot of organizations have also hosting services within the cloud environment. So Office 365 was a very primitive approach to adopting cloud services, but now organizations are moving workloads to the cloud environment. So whether it's in Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform or Oracle OCI, the workloads that are now in the cloud are no longer within on-prem environment. And of course, cloud environment has its own challenges. In fact, you can actually improve your security and implement the right type of security controls in your cloud environment if you know how to do that, right? But unfortunately, a lot of customers move to the cloud environment without really understanding the implication or misconfiguration, or they completely rely on their third parties, which may not implement secure by design practices. Also, there's an importance, like I mentioned, about the data protection and privacy, right? Data protection and privacy are becoming very important. Controlling data sets are very important. You as a data custodian, data owner, data controller, data processor, these are all important terms to understand. And there are also now legal implications. What we find, for example, in the region, some regulators actually fine and penalize organizations for mishandling data sets. And that's going to become more common. And again, the concepts really come from GDPR themselves. The other thing that you find is that the cybersecurity industry in general, whether there are vendors we talk about or service providers, they make a lot of false claims in terms of preventing cyber attacks. Yet we actually do not see a slowdown in attacks, and we also do not find that security controls and mitigation practices actually are effective. The rise of cryptocurrency and the dark web has also changed the economics of cybercrime. So just like I was explaining about ransomware, if I successfully able to compromise a system, then I could get the customer to pay me a ransom using cryptocurrency, which is at the end, you can remain completely anonymous by asking for Bitcoins, for example, directly to my wallet. Of course, you can trace everything because it's on a blockchain, but you cannot trace the actual identity itself, right? Especially if the wallet's been created in a anonymous manner. So the whole economics is also significantly changing, and this is also driving different type of cyber attacks that target cryptocurrency usage, or the use of cryptocurrency as a utility to generate money for the criminals. And what we're also seeing is that cyber attacks are now becoming more weaponized using artificial intelligence and machine learning. So hackers are getting smarter, they're understanding how artificial intelligence and machine learning can be leveraged to launch attacks as well, right? Training the models and then launching them for attacks. And this is what we see from a overall landscape perspective. So you can imagine what the future is going to be like within the next 2-3 years. And as I mentioned, the pandemic has accelerated the digital economy, and this is only going to continue to evolve as we speak. Now, this is a very interesting data set that was taken from global data itself, but you see there are different industries: banking, payments, automotive, retail, pharmacy, and so on. And they were all asked, what are the initiatives from a digital transformation perspective that you're taking? Obviously, there are different priorities in terms of digital transformation and adoption and acquisition of different technologies, whether it's 5G or industrial IoT or cloud technology or blockchain or big data, Internet of Things or industrial Internet of Things, robotics, robotic process automation. And I can go on and on and on and on. There's so many different terms and terminologies that are being thrown in the industry, right? The bottom line is, whichever industry vertical you may be in, you will be going through a transformation. And that transformation may have already started or may already be well advanced, but there is definitely going to be a transformation that's going to be happening across the organization, or even as a startup. And these are some of the challenges that you might be facing. So when we're talking about, startups, what's really driving the economy? So we've seen the rise of fintechs, right? Challenger neobanks, digital banks that don't have a branch, physical branch anywhere. Everything is operated directly on your mobile device. You also see a huge uptake in mobile apps that are exploiting open banking as a technology, mobile wallets, mobile robo-advisories, buy now, pay later functions. You're also seeing that, regulatory compliance and regulatory technology such as, know your customer, KYC, know your business, KYB, digital identity, anti-money laundering, screening functions are now being embedded into opening a bank account. So typically, normally, if I was to open a bank account, what I would have to do is apply online, visit a branch, show my physical passport, show my physical ID card, and then approval would be taken once they do an internal check. And then within maybe 2-3 days, a bank account would be open. Whereas nowadays, you can open a bank account without actually even visiting a branch, taking a selfie, taking a picture of the passport, and there's already automated background checks that are happening. And within 5 minutes, my account is open. And that's really transforming the way we do banking, the way we interact with multiple bank accounts and so on and so forth. Crowdfunding, P2P or peer-to-peer lending, asset management, wealth management, all of these different technologies are really driving the economy moving forward. But when you look at all of these different technologies, whether it's the web front end, the middleware, the interaction with third-party systems, we're transacting with data, we're transacting with information. We need to make sure security is embedded from the source all the way to the platform and any integration points, whether it's through APIs or whether it's the data exchange layer and so on and so forth. And similarly, when we're talking about digital assets, blockchain as a technology, we've all heard of what blockchain is, a distributed ledger, but there are many use cases that you can apply within a commercial space. And there have been many successful projects of how blockchain can effectively reduce the cost of operation from supply chain to tokenization of assets, etc. We're also seeing a rise in uptake in terms of cryptocurrency and different fintech firms, and I'll call them crypto tech firms, that have been set up across the different parts of the region, whether they are exchange platforms or custodial services and so on. But we've also seen a huge increase in the number of hacks against cryptocurrency firms, right? Also decentralized finance, again, so peer-to-peer approach towards decentralized finance. And what we're also seeing nowadays is non-fungible tokens, NFTs, also rising, right? Where non-fungible tokens can be used to tokenize an asset. And then there's many use cases where you can actually buy real estate and put the real estate on an NFT and basically own a percentage of a real estate. And that's really changing the way the economics are looking like from a tech perspective. And you probably have heard recently, Facebook recently invested around $50 million in the metaverse. And this is now being touted as the future of the internet. It's basically a virtual reality world where you can interact with at a personal level. So you can actually own a virtual, you can own a virtual house, virtual land. You build your habitat there, and this is completely changing the way we look at the internet. And if you think of what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, this is essentially what we will be doing and what our kids will be doing. So when it comes to transforming from a perspective of how we look at ourselves from a transformation perspective, adoption of technology and digital transformation, there are some key factors, whether you're in the fintech space or you're doing digital banking, social banking, open banking, you're using super API, health tech, ed tech, agri-tech, legal tech, crypto, blockchain, big data, AI, advanced learning, machine learning, RPA, cloud computing, SaaS, and the terms keep going on and on and on and on, right? At some point, you will be involved in some of these technologies. Some of you may be involved in building some of these platforms, right? And offering it to your customers and so on and so forth. But what's important, what remains constant is cybersecurity and data privacy. That does not change. The principles and the laws of carrying out cybersecurity remain the same, right? The way in which we need to carry out data privacy needs to remain the same. They are adapted towards different threat landscapes that each of these technology platforms inherit from a risk perspective, but the core principles remain the same. Now, as a founder of a cybersecurity firm, and also, as an entrepreneur, helping building platforms myself, I've got some key points that I would like each one of you to take away in whichever phase of the journey you are, whether you are currently thinking about building having a startup, or you're already building an MVP, or you have already progressed and acquired customers, and so on and so forth. Depending on the journey that you're at, just keep these few points in mind that I've put together. So, what are they? The first thing that you should do as an entrepreneur or as a startup is to define core cybersecurity and data protection pillars and principles, right? What do I mean by pillars and principles? These are basically going to be your high-level key points from a strategic perspective, what you need to build your platform on. So here I've picked out 3 things. So if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm building a platform, I want my platform to be trusted. I want to assure my customers that the cybersecurity controls and the internal governance and internal controls that I have has a high level of assurance. And thirdly, I want to build my platform that is resilient. So you've got to have these core pillars defined, right? Now, there could be other 3 things or 4 things or 5 things, but define these core pillars, because this will help you understand how you need to embed these core pillars into your product development lifecycle, right? So build a business strategy, of course, but build a business strategy where security, data protection, trust, assurance, integrity, confidentiality become core pillars of delivering the particular service itself. Point number 2, build a structure within the organization. So you could be a startup, and that doesn't mean that you could be a 1-person, 2-person, or a small team. But also, if you're beginning to grow, build a structure where the internal organization has a culture of safety and security, right? Which is essentially focused around strong internal controls, governance and compliance. Compliance sometimes can be a scary word, right? And people run away from it. But ultimately, strong internal governance will help you achieve the long-term mission, right? And when we talk about governance, here we talk about building policies, procedures, and guidelines. And more often than not, this is something that sometimes can be overlooked, especially if you're a techie or coming from a tech background and you're building a platform and you put less focus on building good, strong internal governance. Ultimately, technology needs to be regulated from an internal perspective. If you're building, for example, AI or using AI within technology, there's a code of ethics around the use of AI as an example. So everything we do within technology needs to be governed. There needs to be practices. Employees and people need to know what to do and what not to do, what's permissible, what's not permissible, and so on. And that's your rules of engagement that you need to establish within your organization. And that's something that you should be building. So build policies, understand how risk management needs to be established, right? And also build a culture of, cyber aware. People should be, tech savvy and know what is a phishing email and so on and so forth. And that's something that, you can start building from an internal perspective. So build strong governance internally. Of course, as a tech company, as a startup, or, as an entrepreneur, you need to be disruptive. You want to be the first to market. You need to be agile. You need to be nimble and dynamic, but don't overlook security, because that could be your downfall, right? And we've seen that so many times. Organizations launch a platform or launch a new version, and there are bugs and there are vulnerabilities, and then immediately there's a release. And you'll find that quite often. For example, a very good example, a big tech firm like Apple, they always release an iOS version, and then within a week or so, a security researcher finds a vulnerability, and they then need to, again, fix that vulnerability. So being a disruptor and being agile in business is a great practice, and you should never lose that as an entrepreneur. But try to introduce what we call a shift left approach. So moving to the left. When I say moving to the left, what that means is whenever we initiate a project, there's a project lifecycle, right? Initiation phase, design phase, validation phase, implementation, integration, commissioning, rollout, production, and so on and so forth. So as we move to the left, or I guess on the right on your side, but as you move to the left, that means security is embedded into the design phase. So if you're building a platform and you need to look at user experience and you need to look at customer experience, bake security into the development practices. And by doing this, you're going to be spending less on fixing things at a later stage when it can be very expensive, rather than focusing on security during the design phase so that it becomes a much more easier ride towards going live. Point 4, identify your key assets, right? I cannot stress on this, and this is really important. But if you're building a technology platform and you have a database of customer records, where you've got not just username and passwords that could be hashed or tokenized or encrypted, but you could be having other personal information of your CRM records and so on and so forth, the user records. Identify your key assets and make sure that you protect those key assets, ring fence them, implement the best security controls there. Ask yourself questions. What would I do if this particular asset or this particular system is compromised? And we're not just talking about a server or a database or a web service. It could also be a process. And when I talk about a process, what that means is if I've got a finance team or finance team that is making payments, the finance team is carrying out a process called payments processing. And that process can also be tested from a security perspective, from an abuse perspective, from a phishing perspective. And so when we're talking about assets or identifying your key technology assets, as well as your digital assets, could be a process, could be a person, could be a technology. Always identify your crown jewels and ensure you put the right security controls and protection mechanisms around those aspects as well. As I mentioned already, ransomware, and I put this as a specific point because ransomware is such a big problem nowadays that a lot of organizations even have put plan B, plan C, plan D, and I know organizations who have actually done that as well. So as an entrepreneur, as a startup, as a tech company, protect yourself against ransomware. First and foremost, have good endpoint security controls. You'll see terminologies like NGAV, or called next generation antivirus, or EDR, endpoint detection and response. But these solutions will help you against ransomware attacks. But as we know, security controls can fail, right? And those security controls that you have adopted, they can fail, and ransomware can still be effective. So always ensure, again, take those crown jewels, make sure that you have implemented offline data vaulting techniques to take those extremely critical data sets completely offline. So in the case of a successful ransomware attack that you unfortunately you're a victim of, you always have a means to recover your data sets. And of course, improve your awareness levels. Always try to understand, how do ransomware come into your organization? It's usually delivered through emails, where an employee may receive a link, and that link is a malicious link. Somebody downloads the file or opens a malicious document, and you give excessive admin rights on a machine, and so on and so forth. So always make it harder for cyber attacks or specific, advanced sophisticated malware to compromise systems. And always have the assumed breach model. What that means is, always ask yourself questions. What if, what if, what if? And if you do that, you will successfully be able to minimize as much as possible the chances of a successful breach causing an impact to your business itself. Number 6, you can outsource development, you can outsource human resources, you can outsource many different departments, functions. You can essentially outsource a lot of things, right? And of course, you can also outsource risk. In the real world, insurance is basically outsourcing risk, like car insurance as an example, right? Or house insurance. But when I talk about real risks, I'm really talking about your reputation, right? So of course, you can outsource many things, but you cannot outsource your brand reputation, right? Consumer confidence and so on. So whenever you're dealing with outsourcing parties, whenever you have outsourced your development, especially as a tech startup or as an entrepreneur, if you're building a technology platform, you may want to outsource some technology development practices, or web development, or platform development, API development, mobile app development, or you might be hiring a blockchain developer to build a smart contract, and so on and so forth. You might be using an outsourced provider at some point in time. Rather than just signing NDAs, which are very primitive, right? You need to make sure you have the checks and balances in place, right? Ensure that when you work with third parties, that they're going to handle your data with due care. Give them guidelines to follow. For example, what we've seen is that a lot of the developers, they develop websites and keep, for example, the source code, or they might be developing certain platforms for customers, and they keep the source code on a public repository, like on a GitHub or a GitLab public repository. What we find is also a lot of the developers tend to use insecure coding standards, right? Which can actually then impact your actual platform itself. So put these checks and balances in place. Make sure that you enforce some of these requirements onto your suppliers. Of course, I've already mentioned this as well, but data privacy protection and generally data governance is overlooked. But what's very important is that customers, when they are transacting with you, they are utilizing your service, they will be sharing a lot of data. And that data is under your, let's say you are storing that data, the data you store needs to be protected. And what we find is that when big companies, or even small companies, when they get hacked, millions of records have been stolen, millions of personal information has been stolen, and so on and so forth. Organizations that are in the EU, they get fined, then they get a heavy penalty depending on the size of the breach. Now, this is something that we're beginning to see in the region, where certain regulators actually fine you and penalize you financially if, for example, you have been negligent from practicing security controls. To ensure, build a framework around data privacy, data encryption at rest, in transit. Make sure you implement the right controls. If you're using and sharing data with third parties, make sure you have data processing agreements in place and securely exchange data, and so on and so forth. There's a huge different domain when it comes to data protection, but certainly something that should never be overlooked. Of course, building security architecture and secure architecture, depending on the type of platform you might be implementing, whether you're implementing open banking platform and you need to integrate with API, there's a certain set of guidelines to follow. If you're building a web app, again, there's web application security controls to implement. If you're storing data at databases, again, there is a huge set of security controls. Protect your cloud environment, introduce a secure product release cycle management cycle, like what was something called DevSecOps or secure SDLC. perform threat modeling, like I mentioned, always keep asking yourselves, what if scenarios? What if this happened? What if that happened? What if my system was to be compromised? And by asking these questions, you're challenging whether your systems are resilient to cyber attacks, whether your systems are protected against cyber attacks, whether you're protected against outside the threat as well as inside the threat as well. And this is something that needs to be really thought about, but work based on a concept, something called zero trust, not to trust anything, and then to allow access on a need-to-know basis, on a limited basis only. And of course, when we're as a startup, as an entrepreneur, you're going to be building platforms, and you always have to take different adversaries into account. Of course, from an organizational perspective, you need to have a risk-based approach. Now, in security, you will have a lot of people who are fearmongers, right? This can get hacked, this can get breached, you could be in a very bad situation. The bottom line is, as an entrepreneur, you need to sift through the myths that are out there. And as somebody who's been practicing cybersecurity for almost 20 years now, and I say this as well, is that always look at hypothetical risk versus actual risk, because hypothetical risk, there's always that possibility it can happen, it may not happen. Look at the likelihood, look at the impact, and try to make an informed decision on how likely that risk can materialize. And that's something that comes to you as an entrepreneur as you start building your platform, as you start getting exposed to the different environments and so on. But it's very important to differentiate between something that's hypothetical versus an actual. A lot of the times, if you were to actually apply security controls on hypothetical risk, you will actually end up spending too much money on security controls and then spending less effort on building a quality product. So always have a balanced approach, always be risk-based, and know your risk appetite. And this is very important as an entrepreneur. As a business, you will be having certain risks. That's one of the reasons why you left and started a startup and so on. But there is going to be a risk appetite that you will have a threshold towards. Understand that in detail and map your tolerance level towards that. Not to say to be too risk averse, but to have a good and balanced approach. And finally, what I would say is, don't overlook security, do allocate budget. It can be costly, but if you nurture the practice early on, and of course, if you begin to understand the importance of cybersecurity and how important it is and how you can build the cybersecurity fabric within your organization, it does not need to be expensive, right? Keep it fluid, right? When I say fluid, the cyber threat landscape continuously changes on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis. And so you need to be agile in your approach in counteracting the latest cyber threats, or carrying out patch management or fixing things that might be discovered, and so on and so forth. Now, these are some of the key points. Obviously, it's still the tip of the iceberg. And what I would say is, if it all sounds too daunting as an entrepreneur, as a startup of your organization, there is professional help. I mean, as entrepreneurs, you might feel invincible, you're breaking grounds. But I would say that cybersecurity and data protection is a specialized area, which it is in many cases. And there is help that's out there, so try to navigate the practice, but of course there's always help out there to help you move in the right direction and build the right platform, product, organization that you're looking to do as an entrepreneur.